the mind right the way through to the retail network so that consumers can make a very conscious decision about their purchases. We went beyond diamonds into colored gemstones, emeralds, rubies, sapphires, luxury goods, and more recently have underpinned the work for the European battery passport for electric vehicle batteries, looking at it from a perspective of not only just the supply chain, but the environmental footprint, ESG.
Okay, great. Keir?
Hi, I'm Keir Finlow-Bates. Some of you know me as Blockchain Gandalf, which is a name I did not give myself, but it seems to have stuck. I started looking at blockchain in early 2010, I think, is what I've narrowed it down to, when someone gave me a copy of Satoshi Nakamoto's original Bitcoin paper and dug through the code, thought it was interesting, and just found myself continually returning to it. Unfortunately, not buying a huge hoard of Bitcoins, which is why I'm still working rather than swanning off around the world like Vitalik Buterin is. I spent some time inventing things related to blockchain and presenting them to my erstwhile employer, who didn't have a clue what they were about. So pretty much all of them were rejected. And then they had a big round of layoffs and I became a full-time blockchain technologies inventor. And I spend my spare time trying to improve the general public's understanding of blockchain technologies by recording and releasing videos about them. So that's basically me. Thank you very much for having me on this panel, Dr. Perry.
Thank you for joining us. Chris.
Well, now I regret that I never defended my doctor thesis. Well, first, the obvious, the funny accent originated in Germany. Please don't hold this against me. I left 22 years ago, live in Southern California now after we sold our first company, which was one of the first internet service providers in Europe. And at the time, I'm full-time moved into VC 22 years ago. We originally focused on multi-massive online player games and voice over IP solutions. And you guys can probably see the similarities between those solutions and what we focus on today, which most people call the blockchain space. We call it something else. I started looking at ideas how to decentralize the web, and I think I call it fixing the web in 2008, and stumbled across Bitcoin, stumbled across Ethereum, met my partner and the fund here who created the Ethereum meetups here in Orange County. So I've been working since on building what I call the web for the first time. So I don't agree with the Web3 narrative. We have been using that term on and off since 2001. There's a lot more. We do a lot of education, largely responsible for Harvard's FinTech program. I have a couple of board positions at standard setting organizations, but spent most of my days looking at startups that fit our investment thesis. I'm going to leave it there. There's a lot more.
Okay, wonderful. Last and not least, Andy.
Hi, Millie. Thank you very much for having me on your panel today. So my name is Andy Martin, and for my sins, I've been a business consultant in the technology space for 25 years now. I'm getting towards the end of my career, which enables me perhaps to be a bit more outspoken than I might have been when I was younger. And I got involved in blockchain about 5 or 6 years ago. And funnily enough, I kind of figured that I've been trying to solve the same problem my entire career, which is trying to stop data getting stuck in silos. And I started off putting in ERP systems when we were trying to stop data getting stuck from one department to another. Then my technology consultant, I got into the SOA space and EDI and integration. And we were trying to move data from company to company. And now with blockchain, it's actually the same problem that we're trying to fix, I think, which is about sharing that data, but now at the level of an ecosystem, or even at the level of a market, which I find really exciting. And I tend to get involved at the beginning of networks. So this is where I work in the enterprise space, so working with enterprise incumbents, where we're really trying to answer the question, what does blockchain mean for my business? What should my roadmap be? What should my strategy be? And then helping these enterprise clients start to create value as a network. So working with their partners trying to decide what are the commercial models, what are the business models. I love sharing what I think, and I tend to be a little perhaps braver than I should be in what I share, but I get a great debate on LinkedIn as people debate with me and we push ideas forward. And I'm particularly interested in moving from using blockchain to optimize the world as it is, to see if we can create a new world as we move into the token economy. And that's what really fascinates me. So maybe I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic. So I don't want to drill in, terms and definitions, but yesterday at Kristen webinar, I stumbled again to John Oliver definition about what is blockchain. And since he's explaining blockchain like this, everything you don't understand about money combined with everything you don't understand about computers, right? Chris, am I following right?
Yeah, that's exactly.
I thought it was brilliant. I heard it before, but this one, I don't know, it was great yesterday to have this.
Well, it's funny because it's largely true, right? That's why people chuckle. And
yeah, can you take it from here? How do you understand or define blockchain or blockchain technology? I saw that you're differentiating blockchain from blockchain technology, so maybe you can help us.
Yeah, and as you know, stop me anytime, because these are all topics that I talk separately about an hour about. But yeah, so since you asked that specific question, yeah, so I think of blockchain and blockchain technology in the same way that I think about the internet and internet technology, which means you can use internet technologies to build applications. That obviously doesn't mean that you're building the internet. You're just using just particular protocols to create an application or solution of sorts. And so what we see a lot, that people claim that they're investing in blockchain technology, for example, which in my mind is just a particular type of encryption, which was not introduced by the Bitcoin white paper, but was mentioned actually in the second footnote, even though neither paper actually uses that particular term. But yeah, there's a lot more fallacies, as you know, that I talk about. But again, I mean, it's all based on the fact how we see technology evolve. Obviously, we are venture capitalists, and as such, we depend on being able to time the market. And in the case of technology investing, it means understanding the timing of the technology, how it evolves. And we have the saying in our space that goes something like, being too early is the same as being wrong. So I've been wrong a lot during my career. We tried to build a unified messaging system on the AOL backbone back in 1994, which was too early in 1994. Today is still too early. And so we see a lot of solutions that we consider way too early. I'm going to leave it here.
Yeah, okay, great. Liane, do you have any interesting definition for blockchain?
No, I don't really have much more to add to that. I think you can spend a lot of time talking about blockchain or the blockchain, and there's certainly not just one. There's permissioned private ledgers versus permissionless public ledgers, and so it's certainly not one shoe fits all. Okay, great. Kea?
Well, I think thinking about that John Oliver quote, which is an amusing one. I didn't understand money at all until about 5 or 6 years ago, in that it was just something that, you know, you had these bits of paper and you handed them over in the shop and you got some bread or some beer or something like that. And that's kind of the understanding that my kids have of money at the moment. You know, they're sort of range between the ages of 5 and 16. And it's kind of shocking when you think about the fact that our whole society runs on the sort of rails of money, and yet hardly anybody has a clue what it's actually all about. So from that perspective, blockchain was brilliant for me because it gave me an education in an area that I would never have thought about thinking about. And this is why for the first 3, 4, 5 years, I was just looking at the Bitcoin code and thinking, oh, this peer-to-peer network stuff is fascinating. The use of cryptography in this way is interesting. How the whole package sort of latches together to create this wonderful playground of a system from a programming perspective is brilliant. But ultimately, what's the point? And I think that was the thing where in sort of 2015, the light bulb went on when I suddenly realized that it's, as a software engineer or a technologist, you think in terms of a sort of an engineering solution, but blockchain is a social solution. It's solving a problem of people in communities. And this is why when you present it to a developer, they will go, I could do this with a database. And the answer is, well, yes, of course you can do it with a database, technically speaking. But what you can't do is get a group of people to accept the solution that you've presented them with, unless you either con them or you're the first mover and there is no other option. And the fact is that there are other options with money. We have a whole bunch of different currencies out there that you can use. And we have a whole bunch of different payment systems. The fact is that blockchain offers, from a financial perspective, a whole new form of being able to transact that we haven't had before. And a whole lot more. That's the other thing. And this is where I kind of take my hat off to people like Leanne and getting involved in trying to produce solutions that move blockchain beyond just the money aspect and into a whole bunch of other things. So, yeah. And I think I should probably be quiet now and give somebody else a chance to talk.
Great. Andy, what can you bring us in this definition challenge?
Well, so I'm going to quote one of my blockchain heroes, and that's a lady called Sherman Vosmegier, who wrote a book called The Token Economy. And she said a number of things that really stuck with me and have kind of guided my thinking ever since. And she said, think of blockchain as a back-end technology for governing the state of objects on the internet. So there's a number of points in there which is really important. It's a governance technology, and we're governing state. So state really means ownership. Who owns what? So these objects are now objects of value. These objects could represent money, or they could represent ownership in data, which could be traded. And I think what's super interesting is when you have this decentralized governance of ownership of valuable things on the internet, it enables you to change the dynamics of power in marketplaces. I think we're too used to a world where...
Deliberately, Andy, I just want to understand, is it deliberately, or you change the balance of forces as a consequence or as an output?
So I think this is a disruptive technology that lets us change the way that markets operate. And I think that right now, we often see in markets that either one person hoards the information and knows everything about a market, or everybody is holding their data and being very reluctant to share their data with other people. As we move into this collaborative environment, then that equation changes. And suddenly that data can be liberated, and we can now start collaborating, and we can now start rewarding the owners of that data. So I think that ultimately blockchain will transform trading in a digital economy, which will emerge over time. Basically, as data becomes currency, I think or a currency, is kind of the point of view that excites me. And I'm starting to have even these sort of conversations with boring old enterprise clients that are kind of stuck in the past. But even there, people are starting to twig, well, actually, I could have a different role here in the marketplace. And we're starting to have those conversations.
I see. Okay, great. And now, just for wrapping up the personal side of your you speakers, I would like to understand whether, since you were in the blockchain industry for long years, I would like to understand whether you have recognized any shift in your own perspectives throughout those years that you're engaging in the blockchain industry. Did you have some vision or some way of looking at the industry or at the technology or other part of the blockchain arena, and through those years you recognize some shifts or some changes in your perspective, Jan?
Look, it's been a great roller coaster ride from starting with the concept in 2013, bringing it to life in 2015. We've seen the explosion of various different ways that you can sort of tokenize assets and or bring stable coins to the market. We've gone through the craze of ICOs, which arguably many companies utilized as a inbound funding mechanism. And now we're on the second wave of cycling in terms of NFTs, the non-fungible token implementations. Thinking about, we are constantly anchored into the real world, the harsh realities of 500-year-old trade systems that are still predicated on a gentleman's handshake, a chit of paper, and a promise to pay. Mazel tov. And so we
Mazel
think that
tov is good for this session.
Correct, it is. And so we think this transformation, not just sort of a digital transformation in the basic forms of trade, but when you overlay the power of this technology, we're able to see incredibly new value systems being created. The trick when you're thinking about the enablement of an entire global industry is, how do you align value and value creation so that there are multiple participants on chain that are being incentivized to engage? And those incentivization systems have been proven to be very powerful, like the mining incentivization system that exists within Bitcoin. But when we think about a private ledger that's permissioned, those value system creations certainly are very difficult to create and form in a human system, let alone in a digital system. And so that's really been the challenge of the century from where we've sat. We've cracked it in terms of one or two industries, and we're looking forward to the next big wave. And that's going to be critical minerals and electric vehicle batteries, because arguably that is we're looking down the barrel of the next blood diamonds disaster if we don't get that right.
Yeah. Okay. Kara, what is your perspective? Have you recognized some shifts in your position?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, for starters, that's been one of the wonderful things about blockchain, is that I look back at what I thought just 3 months or half a year ago, and I think that's naive, but now I've got it, right? And then 6 months later,
so
it's like
the depth of understanding you're referring to?
It's not necessarily about the depth. There's a lot of technological advancement happening all the time. People are coming up with new esoteric things that I then have to spend time grasping and actually deploying and writing code for. But it's the sort of way that you view the world that shifts. And I know, and from a personal point of view, I remember waking up in the middle of the night in 2017 in a cold sweat thinking, have I just spent a fortune on applying for patents and trademarks and writing code and paying people to work in a space that in 2 or 3 years' time, people are going to turn around and say, did you really spend the middle of the decade on blockchain of all things? And it's been a bit of a relief that now when you look at it, it's clear that blockchain is here to stay, that it's not a fad. I always felt that it had some real underlying value in the same way that I wish I'd had about the internet in the 90s. And so in that sense, yes, there's been a shift in terms of public perception of value. And there's been a shift in the responses that we've seen from the incumbents, right? Understandably, initially, blockchain was ignored because it just wasn't on the radar. And then we had a phase where it was ridiculed. People like Jamie Dimon making statements about it's trash.
And rejected.
Yeah. And now we're kind of coming to the end of the sort of verbal attacks. And I don't go a week without getting pointed at an article where the same old tropes are trotted out. It has no inherent value or intrinsic value. It's environmentally damaging. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's used by criminals. It's the same set of arguments that have been picked apart again and again and again, but they just keep trotting them out, and it's just a new mouthpiece. And so presumably we are now going to enter the phase where you start seeing actual active attacks, where it's going to be, you know, we're going to regulate this. And some of them hopefully will say we're going to regulate this in a good way so that we can keep the value but get rid of the troublemakers, which I wholeheartedly approve of. Some of them, unfortunately, are going to try to regulate it out of existence. And the fact is that they're not going to succeed because it's not something that's under one emperor's control. There's no head that you can cut off. So, so there's a kind of the global shift. But for me, it's more about the personal shift. And I remember chatting with Andy a couple of years ago where we were sort of trying to both in our own way come to terms with the concept of blockchain making the pie bigger, I think was the phrase we came up with. So it's like rather than companies scrambling to get the biggest slice of the pie, blockchain offers the opportunity for us to sort of competitively collaborate, thereby making the pie bigger. And that's hopefully better for all.
Yeah, so. Great. Well, Chris, talking about regulating the technology is a misnomer, right? As I learned yesterday in your webinar, because you could not regulate technology, you can regulate citizen behavior. Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's always a conflation. So that it's a usual trick that regulators use where they say like they're outlawing. My typical example for that is that Mexico outlawed quote unquote voice over IP for a decade, which obviously just meant that their citizens were under threat of penalty if and when and where they use this technology. So you don't get to regulate technology as a regulator. Technology is regulated by physics and by math and by software code and so forth. But I want to touch on something that Andy and Leanne said, maybe to open up a conversation. So I agree specifically, unlike what Andy said earlier, blockchains are really state machines, and it's not about recording something. That's why if you read the Bitcoin white paper with diligence, you will realize that it never mentions the word ledger. So DLTs are sort of the opposite of what a blockchain is, because the purpose of a blockchain is simply to hand over control over a set of bytes from A to B. And obviously bytes don't care what you call them. If you call them Bitcoin, US dollars or NFTs or something else, so that's irrelevant. Every token is simply a standardized smart contract that fulfills a particular function, right? So from an investor's perspective, we both do bottom-up investments, so Web3 primitives, i.e. addresses, decentralized compute, decentralized bandwidth, and so forth, and as well as top-down development. And top-down development works in the way where you aggregate the existing incumbents and introduce efficiencies using some type of blockchain-based solutions. So blockchain are really more paradigm than a technology in terms of how you architecture your solution. And there specifically, we stopped using that term because it's widely abused internally. We just call it decentralized software solutions, which then also includes directed acyclic graphs and so forth. Anyway, I'm going to stop myself because you know that I can go on forever about these topics.
Yeah, but you didn't say a word about your perspective. Did it has shifted?
It changes every day.
It's developed.
It changes every day. So as I mentioned, we're using the scientific method to investing. So all the stuff that I published, the only reason why I publish it is for peer review and hopefully make better mistakes tomorrow. And so, yes, my position slightly adjusts every single day. And in terms of blockchains, to make a very wide and hence false statements, I've come to the conclusion that it's the use case is narrower and narrower every day that I look at it, to where you want to do less and less with a blockchain-based solution and probably really only use it to build what Nick Szabo calls digital vending machines. And once you realize where it fits in the overall topology, then you likely already letting go of the idea that these things are protocols, which they are not, because they're within a certain context. They're in the context of network technologies. And so they're obviously making use of actual protocols and so forth. Again, you always have to stop me because I have a lot of pent up energy after 13 years of not having a really wide audience of even being able to understand basic concepts in this space.
Yeah, okay, great. And I would like to step further and try to understand what is the current situation. Care said that first you make laugh of the technology and then you reject it and so on. But as you can see the picture right now, where are we? What is the status? Where are we heading? Do you recognize some specific route we ought to go? Do you recognize some hurdles or challenges that you think are major and with influence or impact the blockchain arena? Liane.
Look, I think there are many parallel universes running at the same time. Governments are awakening to this technology, and so therefore regulators are too, and they're questioning how they can either tax authorities get involved, regulators decide, is this a technology that should be considered a useful rails of trade for securities? And I think that pathway, depending upon where you're situated in the world, can be seen to be an accelerant. Certainly the global south countries.
You mean geographically where you're
geographically located? Sure, like the global south as an example, countries like Estonia, they were very early to embrace the adoption of the base foundations and of course some relative way of either use in real world applications or the tokenization and or creation of coins. But then, of course, there are other countries in the world that are looking at it from a totally different perspective. They're seeing it as a complete disruptor to stability and, you know, flying in the face of anarchy of democracy. And so, but really it is probably the best and amplification of democracy. So, you know, when regulators and governments and politicians get involved, there's all sorts of questions about really how do you get them out of the way, to be brutally honest with you. Then there's the other side.
Can you get them out of the way?
Well, I mean, let's look at what is happening right now with the monetary system between the impending sanctions between Russia and the Ukraine situation. And, you know, digital currencies are still flowing and the SWIFT network is being threatened to be turned off. Google Pay is now being switched off and so too is Apple. So, you know, can governments put a stop signal right in front of the distributed store of value? No, I don't think they can. But the reality is there'll be attempts to be able to do all sorts of things around taxation systems and enablements that will definitely slow down and or cause compromise for the general public in the use of this technology.
Can you see any differentiation between, you know, Western world or developing world? Can you see any consistencies in those definition or?
Yeah, look, I think this technology and the combination of it basically being open source, and we're in the next generation of digital natives and their ability to be born physically with sort of a coding mindset, you know, that it's been taught in school or no coding technology. The global south is an accelerant that will likely overtake, you know, traditional countries that have once stood the test of time in their potential power poles. But I mean, that's sort of my own personal position here. I think that the global south is a very powerful place to be. And, you know, they're not really wrapped up or encumbered by what happened yesterday, because yesterday there was literally a blank canvas, so they can start fresh.
Yeah. So they can frog leap, you think, better than Western countries?
Yeah, look, we've seen this before in the first formation of digital money in inverted commas, which was the enablement of China with QR codes and WePay. And so let's say that's the very first instantiation of some form of, you know, digital money. They didn't have to put in ATM machines and plumb banking systems. And that worked as well for digital identity. Now, is that the right system and the adoption and the approach for the future? Maybe or maybe not. Was it only achieved because there was an authoritarian government? Yes. But if you can put the powers in the hands of the people, then the future is really destined by the people.
Yeah. Okay. Andy, what is your position regarding the current situation, challenges, hurdles? Where do you think we are heading?
Well, so I'm going to quote another one of my blockchain heroes. This is a guy called Nitin Gaur, who is a research director in IBM Blockchain Labs. He wrote a book that was published, I guess, 2015, 2016. And there's a super important chart in there that that predicted what was going to happen in the blockchain market. And I think Nitin was bang on. And you said, well, okay, look, I think there's 3 phases to adoption of blockchain. And each industry may go through a slightly different phase, but you have an experiment phase, you then have an optimize phase, and then you have a reinvent phase. And so I think back at that, we did an awful lot of experimentation, where just about anybody wanted to have a blockchain project so they could put it in their board report. Didn't really matter what it did, just have an experiment, go kick the tires. So that's done. Then we moved into an optimized phase. And remember, I work for the enterprise, so that's the incumbent. And when you have this technology, well, the natural thing to do to say is, well, okay, what's the problem I'm fixing? Well, the problem I'm fixing is if I have all this data stuck in silos, I've got a shed load of reconciliation. If I can get rid of that reconciliation, I can take a load of cost out, right? So we've gone through a big optimization phase, which is kind of aligned to the private permissioned kind of blockchain enterprise paradigm. But I think where we are in the market right now is we're now shifting gear and we're now moving into the reinvent phase. And what's interesting with the blockchain, of course, is you don't reinvent at the level of a single company. You reinvent, first of all, at the level of an ecosystem, a network, but that's going to grow into a market and then potentially grow into an entire industry. And as we start reinventing, we're changing that power equation, and the power is going to the data owner, the sovereign individual. So if you take an industry like health, then suddenly you start saying, well, the digital native, this under 42-year-old patient, and I have to say I'm in my 50s and I had exactly the same thinking, so just simply will not tolerate the as is. I need to be in control of what's happening. So we're moving into a much more reinventing phase, and that data that the patient has is phenomenally valuable. It can be monetized. It's really helpful for developing precision medicine, mass customization of medicine, driving innovation in the value chain, and driving.
You think nothing would stand in his way to monetize its information and data?
So if you talk about healthcare, then this is about the most regulated industry on earth, and I can certainly remember we've tried to do EHR records and failed dismally. So compliance is absolutely the issue. But I think what's interesting is you start to say, well, hang on here. If I own my data and if I give permission, then why do I need GDPR? It's my damn data. I may have an autonomous agent that is handling this interaction with me. I may not have the skills to do this, but suddenly I got really frustrated. I spent a lot of time in hospitals in the last few years. I got really frustrated with just how ancient and unpatient-centric the processes are. And if I won't tolerate it, the next generation of kids are certainly not going to tolerate it. And as you change the power, because remember, it's all about power, and you change the control, it's all about governance, governing the state of your data and access to your data, you suddenly can build new business models. So I think an industry like healthcare could be massively transformed. Now, it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? Because there's so much regulation and there's this is maybe 10 years away in terms of it actually happening.
But you're saying the regulation is the answer and the problem as well at the same time? You said you'd have to be compliant.
Yeah, so I'm coming from the enterprise space, so we have to be, this is why we have private blockchain, because you need to be compliant, right? So we have no choice, we have to be compliant. But if we're playing with strategies, we can kind of push the equation a little bit. And I think something that Vitalik Buterin said a few weeks ago, again, was super interesting when he talked about zones of sovereignty. And I thought that's bang on the money here. So rather than just having this decentralized autonomous organization, this network, which is just impossible to kind of pin down, I think they'll be aligned to specific markets. So we'll have like a healthcare market in Europe or a healthcare market in America, and it will be regulated within that zone of influence. I think that's the only way you're going to change an industry like healthcare. Otherwise you're going to be off in industries which are not regulated. And
I'll just jump in because Chris is he didn't raise his hand, but he wrote something in the chat. Chris, can you want to relate to Andy's
overall, I think Well, overall, I think the most important thing to understand is that we are finally building the World Wide Web. And in order to do so, we need to change its topology. So right now, the network technology with the Internet World Wide Web being the most visible one, basically treat all human behavior and all humans the same way they would treat other endpoints that are IoT devices. So we'll just observe its behavior, store, copy the data that this individual creates, and then refactor it whenever you engage with a platform. So you get to control online right now what we call a persona, and then when you're engaging with a platform, it adds data on its own, calls it a profile, starts profiling you. So that's how we ended up with the social engineering as a service solutions. And when you are online, you're either a non-player character in a game called Google, or you're a non-player character in a game called Facebook, and that has all to do with the ability to control your own quote unquote data, your own digital dust. And so that's why it's important. Everything is standing in that context, as in we already have all the laws and legal regulations that would actually protect human agency, but we haven't been enforcing them because we haven't built the technologies, the attribution and agency layers in order to do so. That's why, while I'm a co-chair of the Banking and Financing at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, I actually don't like the word because it's not about identity. Identity requires consciousness. This is about agency and attribution, as in, do I get to control my own bytes or don't I? And in that context, it's also always a fallacy to use these broad scale metaphors. I mean, every token, as I mentioned, is just a standardized smart contract. You can't really tokenize anything that's not already natively digital. That's kind of using a metaphor like I took a picture with my phone and now this house is digital. That's obviously nonsense. So at scale, what we're talking about is legal technologies, and that's where the biggest vacuum is, in the intersection between technology and legal concepts. And then, well, fortunately or unfortunately, this particular space, our industry, if you can call it that, is actually led by almost engineers only, and then by a few lawyers that pretend they know what's going on in technology. And unfortunately, what we see on a daily basis, and I've seen 1,000 times, that lawyers will explain the letter of the law rather than the objective of the law to engineers, who then already don't understand legal concepts, but now more than ever double down on prior mistakes. I might make
but who you think would be adequate to this mission? If lawyers are,
we need to create
law-oriented and technologies can sit within the box, who will deal with that?
Yeah, so we need to create a whole new educational system that refers to legal engineering, and part of our efforts is to bridge the knowledge gap between those two things. So we're using useless terms like digital assets, right? So there's no such thing there. You have rights where you can transfer those, and you need to understand these legal concepts in order to be able to code them. So by and large, I'll make one example that would, or two examples that might make this clear. So by and large, I expect that we will replace most database solutions with decentralized software solutions, because the current scenario is not tenable. Last year, externalities from cybercrime exceeded $6 trillion, which is larger than the entire GDP of Israel or Germany, for that matter. And that's large an externality of the fact, obviously most of that is social engineering, but then an externality of database solutions that grant those individuals broad rights to the data that's being stored. So what is important to understand is that we need to, there's no hope for us to actually clean up this digital landfill that we call the World Wide Web. So the only way to address this, actually create new digitally native things like government issued credentials, i.e. a digital driver's license, which then henceforth will invalidate the existing copies of my PII. So that you basically, to simplify this massively again, can create an application that basically says, this is a do not call list on all my personal private information. And then last point, if and when you're doing this, you're actually changing the law and changing technology. So what I mean by that specifically, if when where I have the technology to attach PII to personal private financial transactions only under a court order, then doing this wholesale approach to financial surveillance that we have come to know as KYC will simply simply be unlawful and in the context of the United States unconstitutional. So we'll simply invalidate the legacy system. So we are also looking at this from the perspective, we need to invalidate legacy business models. That's why we looked at a lot of like data selling schemes. None of those have gotten any traction. Most people at scale are largely not interested in selling their personal identifiable data for pennies or often less, right? So that's not really interesting. Anyway, I'm going to shut my curtail myself here.
Well,
So now I get
I'm
really
so happy that you're, sharing all your very deep understanding. And I'm going back to Care. Originally, we just wanted to understand whether we have new challenges. Do we have new barriers, new problems that we have to tackle? How do you think? How do you see this current situation?
I don't really understand the question, to be honest. Mainly because I've been thinking about a whole bunch of stuff that Chris has been saying, and to what extent I agree. Than my questions. Yeah, and to what extent I agree and disagree with him.
Okay, raise your disagreements.
Yeah, well, for example, he says that you cannot digitize a house, and he's right. You can't live in a digital house, given that we live in the real world, and you can't sort of suck it into a computer network like some kind of science fiction movie, Lawnmower Man or something like that.
In a minute, we will have the metaverse and the avatars and the worst nightmares, Chris nightmares will come true.
Yeah, but the thing is that when we're talking about why you would want to digitize, in quotes, a physical asset, the fact is that most physical possessions are actually owned through records in the digital space, right? When we talk about ownership, it's like control over something. So if I've got here's a USB drive that I have, right? I've got it here, I own it. Chris doesn't own it because he can't take it off me. I own the house that I live in because there's a registry in the country of Finland that says that, it's got my name against, well, mine and my wife's, so I half own it. And the reason why we use registries is because it's very inconvenient to carry a house around in your pocket or to have a standing army defending it from other people who are trying to kick you out of it and have control over the house. So we come up with a more peaceful solution, is to have a list of these are the properties and these are the people who own them. Now, that works because the government backs it up. That ultimately, if somebody comes and tries to kick me out of my house, then I turn to the state and they send the police around and they get the other guy at the place. And you see where this goes wrong when you have citizens which have different standings in society. Bad periods in history where governments have turned around and said, we no longer respect these registries. And this, I think, may be what Chris is getting at, is that when you have a registry saying that somebody owns something and it's a decentralized one on a blockchain, how do I then get how do I get to enforce that? It's all very well for me to say I own my house because it says so on a blockchain, but now I no longer have an authority that I can turn to and say, look, somebody is abusing my ownership rights, and I want you to do something about it, unless it's a government that is running it, at which point you kind of get to the point again of, well, why aren't they using a database then? It's more efficient. So is that kind of some of the stuff you were getting at with regards to not being able to digitize?
Yeah, it's more complex. So as opposed to in the chat, well, ownership is not the same as control. It's just one of those elements, right? So it's important. In my mind, it's binary. So if we are changing digitally native assets and I can do everything through a smart contract system, I can send you a Bitcoin, you send me a CryptoKitty back or something to that extent. But if I send you a Bitcoin and expect a real world kitty back and it doesn't come, then I need to have the
recourse. And you're right, this is the thing about the blockchain space, is it's deterministic. Right. As long as I've got the knowledge to go and look at what is coded up there, I know when I look at a contract that if I do this, I'll get that out. So you talked about vending machines,
Correct.
It's a super reliable vending machine. I know that when I put the dollar in, I get the chocolate bar out in a way that is much, much more predictable than actual real vending machines, which occasionally don't give you your chocolate or give you two. The flip side, of course, is that a vending machine, from my personal experience, is very simple. Whereas when you look at these smart contracts, I can read the code and understand it, but there are plenty of bugs that I'll miss, and most of the time I don't want to spend 3 days analyzing the code that constitutes this digital vending machine in order to decide whether I want to interact with them or not. With the vending machine, I'm thirsty now, I put my euro in, I get my can of Coke. Nobody wants to spend a week determining whether or not they should put their money in. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you there, but I'd like to know how do you distinguish between ownership and control then?
So, I mean, you can own your house, but then someone else lives in and has control over it. And maybe the bank has also a right against that particular property and so forth.
Okay, right.
So the point there being, though, is we're confusing like the narrow scope of the technology, as in we're really not talking directly about peer-to-peer solution, unless maybe in the world where you write down your private key in a paper wallet and hand it over. But in most situations, when you have more complex assets or rights, usually rights, you have a layered system, as in you need a set of authentication, verification, certification. And our expectation is that these digital vending machines will be more complex as we start onboarding things to be more digitally native, i.e. if and when and where I have a digitally native title to my house and or a title to my car and so forth. At that point in time, yes, I'm getting closer to being able to facilitate this using a smart contract network. But until that happens, we'll basically are limited to digitally native assets. That's why at the current state of the technology, basically it's entirely insulated from real world economic activity, and it's a multi-massive online player game, which is not meant disparaging. It's just the state of the technology right now. And that's really something we should have been doing.
Finance is kind of a big MMG as well, isn't it? This is one of the things that when I started thinking about it, is that the difference between monopoly money and real money. It's just
we won't get into the terminology and definition of money. We can stay here for 2 years. I'd be very happy to do so, but I would like to raise, since we are getting to the end of this wonderful hour we spent together. There were some questions from the audience, but I would like, before we get into those questions, we talked about control and ownership, and I would like to ask whether you can, some of you or one of you can relate to the issue of tokenization or ownership in a decentralized way. Can you? I know Andy is talking about the tokenization economy. Would some of you can relate to that? Refer to these ideas?
Well, so Millie, this is Andy. I mean, certainly from my perspective, I think the future of blockchain is the token economy. So trading of ownership of these tokens in your wallet. And I do agree with Kia in that I think that these tokens will be linked to physical items. And this is already happening. If you look at a marketplace like Atomize, which comes from Token Trust, they have tokenized the trading of palladium. So there you have physical bags of palladium, and then you have tokens. And the advantage of having this token economy is that you can clear and settle at the same time. So they have a stable coin for US dollars. They have a stable coin. They have the coin representing the asset, and you can start to drive new types of markets and innovative markets. And they're just at the beginnings of this. So I think this link from the physical to the digital, I think, becomes increasingly important.
You're talking about digital twin, something like that, because I know Chris is referring to supply chain and usage of NFT in this regards. Are you referring to digital twins?
As one technology, I mean, there's any number of technologies to link the physical to the digital. I particularly like the story about selling whiskey in China, and 1/3 of whiskey sold in China is counterfeit and is made in a bath, apparently. But what you can do is you can digitize the light signature going through a bottle of whiskey, put that on the blockchain, and then the barman can actually validate that with his iPhone, which is a wonderful example of how you can link the digital and physical with a real world application of drinking fine whiskey in China.
I see. Okay, Lian, do you have any position on this tokenization?
Yeah, look, I think it's exciting.
Economy?
I mean, certainly we've tokenized the world's gemstones. We have about 30% of the entire world gemstones of emeralds on Everledger. But what I'm most excited about is the digital derivative that is a part of that gemstone. For example, the carbon credit or the greenhouse gas emission calculation. That to me, particularly when we start thinking about the complexities of scope 3, which is not direct or indirect, but the accumulation of that footprint across an entire supply chain, then definitely it's not only just about linking the physical itself, but ultimately there's entire marketplaces that will be built up based on that digital derivative of that object.
I see. Okay, Chris, would you like to highlight very shortly about the connection between supply chain and NFT?
Yeah, so we've been teaching that particular topic for the past 4 years. We were actually the first ones to actually create NFTs. I'll send you the blockchain link if you want proof. But the point there being, yes, so I don't find digital collectibles too interesting. I see the real world applications like in supply chain. That's probably the most low-hanging fruit. Think about it every time you get something like a receipt. That should already be an NFT, and the NFT should accumulate all the metadata that this item creates in the real world. And our example slide, we typically make the example of a bottle of wine, so that at the point of sale where
you're consistent with what was it? Champagne? No, whiskey and bottle of wine. Okay, I can handle that.
So yes, I agree that there will probably in some not so distant future a digital clone of every physical item, simply because right now half of the data, for an example, in supply chain lacks integrity, as in it's in some shape or form wrong. There's a duplicate entry for it. There's a typo in it, and it's causing enormous actual real world damages. So that's why it's one of the low hanging fruits. So every time you get a piece of paper, you should think, how could I make this into an NFT that actually provides real world value to you, right?
Just a note from Frederick in the the viewer. He's referring to the sync of those two items. Do you see any problem with that?
Okay.
I mean, certainly from a diamond perspective, we're able to catch a puff, which is a physical unclonable feature of an object. Diamonds are like snowflakes. They're unique by their very nature. And so by various means of machine vision technology, spectro, various types of ways that we can identify a diamond, we don't have to serialize it. Certainly you do have a diamond that has a serialization. We see technologies like RFID, radio frequency identification, being added, NFC being added, but these are typically applied to an object. To perfect the ability to identify an object, you have to find its puff, that physical unclonable feature, which is a forensic science of objects.
But the physical connection, the I don't know, fingerprint on the physical item is still, we don't have enough technologies for that. Am I wrong?
Depends on your industry. I mean, the industries that we choose, we definitely have puffs. That's one of the reasons why we chose it, and we didn't track tomatoes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you've got high value, unique objects. So it's kind of the point I would start.
Yeah, but
compared to doing supply chain for tracking bags of grain, right? I mean, diamonds are non-fungible.
But
they're at the non-fungible end of the spectrum anyway. Whereas if you go down to commodity items like potatoes, you're sort of stuck at things with getting close to being fungible.
But you won't manage item by item. I presume that you will.
Container.
Sorry,
for example.
The container.
At that point, you'd manage the container as a whole.
For instance.
As an
more larger units, maybe.
Yes.
Care, do you refer to the specific bottle of wine, or for you know, chunks of commodities?
I don't honestly know. I mean, I looked at supply chain a while back, and I have a couple of patents on RFID plus blockchain solutions. Haven't managed to sell them to anyone, so but I think it's a really hard space. It's one of the reasons why I avoid it. I'm a sort of a mathematician by training, and
good practice.
I mean, my dad thought chemistry might be a good idea for me, but I ended up going to maths because it's, you know, there's no actual physical objects involved. You can do it all in your head if you're good enough. And I see that these kind of practical applications, I mean, that's why I said I've got immense respect for Leanne and for Andy as well, because they're trying to deal with the messy part of it, you know, and I like to keep it a bit, I'm a bit more
within the math. Okay, yeah. Chris, do you have any specific technologies that you dealt with in order to trace the objects?
Yeah, lots, but maybe it's more helpful to think of this in one of two ways. So like Leanne alluded to, so sometimes you might have an IoT device that already feeds this data kind of as an Oracle function to an existing digital entry that I can transfer peer-to-peer, quote unquote, using a standardized smart contract like a token. But then you have things where you're still, for the time being, and in some cases forever, will be relying on people actually generating this data. So in those use cases, and we've seen some of those, you will see kind of a new creation of a gig economy, to where these particular individuals that fulfill this current functions will be less and less, because they're going to be automated away, but they're going to have a larger addressable footprint to provide their service. But in order to do that, we need to provide the, let's call it, reputation systems that we can assign to these online personas, not to identify anybody, but to identify the performance of a particular node in the network. Ultimately, all humans are the actual endpoint of the network, right? We need to simply reverse this paradigm where the network serves humans again, rather than making them non-player characters. But so for
even though in the future, or maybe we commence in those days themselves, you know, there would be machines to machines. It won't be only human at the end of the network.
Well, technologies, in my personal opinion, should serve the human, not the other way around, right?
Yeah, but machines are serving the human at the end of the day.
Well, right now, by and large, network technologies don't do that, right? So right now, Google thinks you're worth your time that you're spending on there is $185.
Yeah, you're right.
A year.
You're right.
It translates to you 35 being worth 35 cents for any hour that you're spending on there, right? So the larger point there is, obviously, in that particular example, search, if it was actual search, it would get better every time you're using it, because it adapts to you. But obviously that's not the case, because Google is not a search engine, right? Google is a social engineering as a service solution that serves the actual clients, which are the quote unquote advertisers, which advertising hasn't been sold by these companies for a decade at this point in time. But so in order to change that, again, you need to simply be able to exert control over all your bytes, so that you're accumulating that and you're getting to set the direction. Right now, you're not getting to set the direction. That was the original intent of the web at large, right? It's a coordination technology, but we have let it evolve in this digital landfill where everybody is just a non-player character whose data and information is being harvested and ultimately kind of used against them. So larger point there being is we need to go back to the original idea of why we developed something like a .com and push commercial content there, commercial information there, because this is all about information exchange and coordinating human activity at scale. But in order to do that, we need to simply take out the existing bottlenecks. So we have about 1,500 companies that we aggregated over the past decade, where we'll simply over time invalidate those, because they have certain database entries that they should have never created that refer to you. And we have like a long laundry list now where finally regulators are going after these violations and starting at scale to actually penalize these companies. So if you're Facebook, you might be able to survive a $5 billion million fine by the FTC and a $550 million settlement with the state of Illinois. For most other companies, that's not possible. So the point there being is I've been asking for a very long time that developers out there actually provide us with these solutions, as in provide me with the digital forensic tools that shows me if and when and where my data is being abused in a way that I never consented with.
Yeah.
And so our advice, last statement here is, and like taking on the lens of someone who relies on digital solutions in order to avoid being targeted, as in I'm a dissident in the Middle East who's being persecuted with all the powers of that nation state. Well, at that point in time, you can only use digital technologies that do not de-anonymize you. And so we work with NGOs and consult with them to provide them with the information and the guidance paper so that these individuals can use technology safely. And my bar for technologies is if someone is being persecuted with all the force of the government and being targeted and profiled by digital solutions, then your solution, if it doesn't serve this particular individual, really no one should be using it, right? Not a single person in the world should be using it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I would like to raise some issues that were raised on the chat, and it's always come out of in talks about blockchain. Would some of you or one of you can relate to the quantum issue? What would happen to the blockchain once we will have the quantum computing power in the hands of corporates or forces from in this some sort of capacities? Can you relate to that, Liane?
Look, I'm not a cryptographer, so I'm not really best to answer that question, to be honest. I think you probably have more intelligent minds to answer that question.
Well, the mathematicians care.
Is that me? Okay. I don't think it's a big issue in the long run. I think it's a speed bump or a hiccup. And the thing is, we'll probably, I'd say it's highly probable that we will have plenty of advance warning that it's coming. It'll be a pain in the neck for some of the legacy blockchain systems in that they'll have to change the encryption algorithms or the digital signing algorithms that they use. But I think, like, Bitcoin, they're already working on it. Moving towards a different signing algorithm. And so I think it's just people getting excited about two things that go back to John Oliver, everything that people don't understand about quantum physics combined with everything that they don't understand.
No, but this is, it is somehow positioned as a major issue.
But let's say that tomorrow some secret criminal group turned out to have built an underground quantum cracking computer in their lair. And the first thing they're going to go after is the banks, right? Banking uses digital, uses encryption, and it's a much, much bigger target than blockchain.
Yeah, you're saying blockchain would be our last
well, it'll certainly be low down on the list. I mean, if I was running that kind of outfit, I would be going after the banks first. And, there's all sorts of stuff out there that you can then start cracking. And it's also, the fact is that it's becoming pretty evident that being tracked on a blockchain is actually easier than being tracked in conventional finance systems. So again, this kind of, if you're going to commit crimes using your quantum cracking computer, you want to be doing it in an industry that is actually opaque, and that is not transparent, and that has a history of trying to hide things that go wrong with it. This is another one. So I'd say quantum computing, don't worry about it.
Won't be a concern?
No, not if the question is quantum computing going to disrupt blockchain? It's like, by that point, it's going to have disrupted everything else. So, not an issue with blockchain.
In order to sum up some of the issues, I don't want to go back and talk about the issue we raised, but I would like to pop some terms and to see who would bite. Okay, I can talk about trust. We didn't say a word about trust. We didn't say a word about CBDC. I know Christian is eager to talk about it. We didn't say a word about DAO that maybe Andy will be interested to talk about. We didn't use even once the word censorship or banking the unbanked. We can't resume this kind of talk without, just touching those issues. Who would like to pull out of the hat one of them?
I'd like to talk about banking for the unbanked, and I'd like to talk about my favorite blockchain of all, which is called Plastic Bank. And I think that's a brilliant example of actually solving a really big problem. And if you look at Plastic Bank, the problem that it's solving is actually poverty. Because if you look at the amount of plastic which ends up in the ocean, it flows down rivers and collects on beaches where in developing nations. Where there are many poor people. And what the Plastic Bank has done is it's come up with a model which says, well, okay, if I use a blockchain, what I can do is I can incentivize the locals to collect the plastic, take it to a collection center, earn a credit, which can be recorded on an account on a smartphone, which could be owned by the center or ultimately by themselves. But what's really interesting here is that provenance which you're creating on the blockchain is not only useful for the consumer products company that's using that plastic for creating shampoo bottles, it also creates identity. And you're now starting to get identity of somebody who doesn't have a national insurance number, doesn't have an address, doesn't have any identifiable objects. Identity.
Do you relate to identity as Christian talked about digital dust?
Oh, well, actually, no, because here what we're doing is we're creating an ability where the Plastic Bank can now create credit. They can lend money to these individuals simply based on their track record of collecting and bringing their friends into the network and growing the network. So you create a reputation, a pseudo-anonymous reputation, and then lend against it. And I think that's one of the most wonderful examples about bringing banking services to the unbanked. So as they collect more bottles, they can be awarded their own phone. They can build up credits as tokens on their account. They can take this to any number of retailers that accept this in the area and buy subsidized rice, buy subsidized oil, and various products for the house. But more importantly, they can borrow against it. And there's one wonderful example of somebody who has borrowed against it and has created a business where they are literally 3D printing those recycled plastic on site and building houses out of plastic bricks on site. And this has been built in Haiti, which was completely destroyed by storms. So you have a complete desolation. The only asset you've got is rubbish. And yet here you have an entrepreneur with nothing other than rubbish and a smartphone. And the smartphone is probably in the center at this stage, has now created a business to build houses out of bricks. And I just think that's the most amazing example of this technology.
Yeah, it is. Eliana, I'm sure you can relate to that, right? You're dealing with developed countries, and you can see implementation of this idea.
Yeah, most certainly. I think the best example of trust is just the recent Ukraine-Russia OFAC series of decisions and the enablement on Everledger. All of our retailers and trade were able to enact under a smart contract layer to remove Russian diamonds from the US retail segment within the scope of time. So other countries, of course, Australia is not formalized any of their sanction regulations, but certainly from a trust perspective, we've built an entirely new digital rails of trade that respects conflict, from blood diamonds, which we know so very well, right the way now into sanctions, being faced by Russia. And who knows, in the future, we might have climate sanctions. That too might actually become a very real reality across the world.
Wonderful idea, indeed. Care, any of the items you want to relate to?
I think censorship is an interesting one to me. But I just wanted to crack a little joke in there, Andy, which is that a cynical person could look at the Plastic Bank and say, so we're taking people who have nothing and we're getting them in debt. But of course, the idea is that they go into debt to have the opportunity to build more wealth.
Christian just said, wrote on the chat that he wants to unbank the bank. So we will get to him in a minute. So
Right.
yes, Kerr, sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, that's something that I have always found interesting, given that I got into a lot of trouble at school without actually intending to by speaking my mind, is that one of the things that public permissionless or open blockchains provide is effectively a form of protection against censorship. So, and I find it very interesting, this balance that we're going to be walking between regulating to protect society versus giving people the opportunity to express more freedom. And what was the point that I was actually trying to get to here?
Censorship?
This is where I'm going to be watching with interest what happens with the regulation, because I've worked for some companies that look at how can we comply with regulations. And one of the things that has always struck me is that the only thing that ultimately seems to constrain regulatory bodies is when they expand their remit to the point that they reach the boundaries of other regulatory bodies. So when you look at, for example, the US, the SEC thinks everything is a security. You know, you could show them a banana and they say that's a security. The only, except they don't, because there's the Commodity Trade Commission or whatever it is, the guys in Chicago who would say, no, that's a commodity. So now we're controlling that. And so that's
We're talking about control and ownership.
Well, we're talking about regulation versus censorship, you know, when it strays into censorship. And this is one of the things I think is interesting about blockchain is it's the first real sort of challenge that these bodies have had to actually think other than criminal activity, right? Because you can sort of say, well, these guys are conducting a scam and therefore we need to protect people against falling for that scam in the future, which is the idealistic idea behind these regulatory bodies. The interesting one is that blockchain has brought along a world where there's the ability of regulators to control them gets difficult. And as Chris was saying, you can't regulate technology. You can only regulate the people who use the technology. And so I think it's going to be an interesting time to see. I think a lot of veils are going to be pulled off various regulatory bodies, and we actually start to understand what it is that they really do. Because it's one thing, you know, banks being regulated. Yeah, well, they're banks. You know, I was never concerned about banking regulation because it wasn't going to affect me. I'm not a bank. Suddenly, I'm in the situation where I'm an ordinary citizen, and there are these laws starting to be discussed that will actually directly impact what I can or cannot do with my life in the financial space in a way that, you know, and you kind of accept that there are laws that stop you from driving on the wrong side of the road. You know, that's a form of regulation, but it's one that I wholeheartedly approve of. On the other hand, when you get to the point where you sort of discover that they're going to try and ban me from having a 256-bit number, possibly, well, then, you know, we're sort of getting into the realm of what is being achieved here. And you start getting an insight into some of the agendas, you know, that different bodies have and that don't necessarily match what they profess their reasoning is. So I find that particular side very interesting anyway. But that's my say there.
Okay. Chris, you want to forward with the censorship, or you want to unbank the banks?
Well, one thing that's important to understand here, you first and foremost have to understand the objective of regulation. So most of the time, blockchain is actually the solution to that particular problem, i.e. A lot of the regulation that's in place to regulate financial service providers is because they put themselves into a position where they cause what's called a principal agent problem, as in I now have control and actually ownership. In this particular case, if you hand money over to a bank, and so now you have a claim against the bank, so the bank is custodying, quote unquote, something maybe of your property as well, i.e. you have a safety deposit box. So overall, it's about creating technologies, to use a kind of a old metaphor, that cannot be evil, rather than require the middleman not to be evil, right? So once you do that, again, you're getting to a stage where at that point in time, if the bank cannot be evil, i.e. if they have the same position in digital space that they have in physical space, where they only have a secondary key to a digital lockbox and they only provide additional safety function, at that point in time, They don't need insight in what you have in that digital lockbox, and that then does away with a lot of the principal agent problem that typically is being addressed by regulation and causes that particular overhead, right? So that's at the core what people should be thinking about. So that's why I would like to see the function of specifically middlemen like banks to be reduced to just providing blind custody, for example. And they should want the same thing, by the way, because it's a large attack surface if and when and where you have database solutions that contain a tremendous amount of PII and govern a tremendous amount of capital. Like my colleague said earlier, it's like they are the bottleneck, they are the centralized entity that's mostly going to be affected by these type of cyber crimes, which you can do not entirely away with, but wildly mitigate by just removing the ability of them to have control, just like we saw in Canada right now. Essentially, financial service providers by and large are deputized agents of the state, and that power that we gave to them should have probably not ever have been given to them, i.e. the ability to create money, and they're specifically money from nothing, which then debases the overall money supply, but primarily debases the asset class. And then furthermore, if and when and where we actually have digital bearer instruments that you can transfer instantly with settlement finality, at that point in time, the state of debasement doesn't actually have to exist. It's important to understand that digital money never actually exists in a state of custody. It always exists in a state of lending from a legal perspective. But with decentralized software solutions, most people call them blockchain, you actually have the ability to defer that particular right to that particular asset to the endpoint, to the actual user through the rightful owner. So that's why we should introduce this instantly. To me, it's a crime against all citizens, as in that I don't get full control over all my bytes, because the equivalent now when everybody's being charged to fulfill a payment function, an industry that last year made up $2.7 trillion. That to me is like forcing people to put stamps on email. There's no reason for that to exist, right?
Yeah, I heard this example. It really...
Well, and so but the reason that we should demand this is if we assign the power to create quote unquote money, and again, money is just an agreement between two or more parties. Currency is the standardization of that agreement. At that point in time, that money is a public good and should be treated as such. But overall, only legal tender laws actually force you to use the government's money. If you decide that for private commerce, you and I would just want to use Pokemons as money, then Pokemons are money. It just solves a particular problem, the double coincidence of one's problem. Anyway, again, you always have to stop me because I get very excited to finally have
Yeah, sure. I would like to wrap up and ask each of you to, as the OGs of the blockchain industry, which one major advice that you would give for newcomers, for new professional in the blockchain industry? Do you have any wisdom to transfer to them as you know, in a form of advice, or what to do, what not to do? Liane?
Look, it's an evergreen, ever-learning space, and it is the next generation of the internet. So roll up your sleeves and start reading and start typing.
Okay, great. Andy?
Well, I'd like to go right back to where I started and just remind everybody, blockchain is a governance technology. It is for governing the state of objects of value, could be money or ownership, on the new internet. But think of blockchain as a governance technology.
Great, wonderful. Care?
Oh, advice if you're getting started on blockchain.
A good one, if you wish.
Right. Okay. Well, my advice would be that you should get a copy of this book.
Okay, great.
It's in Italian or in English.
The blockchain Gandalf.
Well, that's where I put all my. I mean, it is now a year and a bit old, but it's actually dating well. I mean, the thing is, you can write thousands of pages on this topic. This is what makes it so fascinating, and there's lots of different conflicting opinions. So actually, my piece of advice would be, don't just take someone's word for what they say. Think about what they said and think about what it means to you, and then try and consider some other perspectives. So don't just take on trust what people are saying to you, even if they're walking through the woods wearing a wizard hat. Doesn't mean that they are 100%.
I saw that hat. Wonderful. Great.
Yeah.
Chris, last words
Well,
of advice to the newcomers.
Oh, well, I'll piggyback on what you just said, and you heard me say this many times probably already. So unfortunately, reality doesn't have an advertising budget. So everything that you read online about our topic, about cryptocurrencies, blockchain-based solution is usually some form of motivated reasoning. So the best thing you can do is first start learning the language of the space. It's its own language. It's very important to understand. If you want to understand a particular discipline, you want to first learn the language. And for most people to this date, I can't actually have an educated discussion because we need to spend the first half hour simply understanding what each other's definition of certain concepts are in that space. So that's why everybody that hasn't entered the space yet, a message here, it's still super early, only about 5% of the world's internet users actually has a wallet and in principle can engage with blockchain-based solutions. And I would like you to think of wallets more as browsers than anything else, as in a browser that contains private keys that let you manipulate certain entries that are being transferred on a blockchain. And I phrase it specifically this way because it comes up again and again that people are thinking of blockchains as ledgers and storage devices. Do not think of this. They are state engines, right? So the ledger's purpose is to synchronize the nodes and make sure that you're only dealing with quote unquote honest nodes. So that's why read the abstract of the Bitcoin white paper, embrace that, learn those concepts, and then familiarize yourself with the narrow definitions within the space, i.e. what's the difference between uppercase B Bitcoin and lowercase b Bitcoin? What are the different actual use cases? You should always ask when someone tells you we have quote unquote blockchain adoption, crypto adoption. It's like, okay, for what, by who, when, and so forth. And a lot of times people will just say back your statements like this is money or this is value transfer. That is utterly meaningless. So you want to always actually move backwards from the actual problem and what is the problem that you're solving. And the one simple example I always make, that there's a large discussion about the topic of stablecoins, which is utter nonsense, because every implementation of the different stablecoins, it's somewhat different. There's some that are just US dollar pegged and backed, and there's others that are algorithmic. And then the larger point there being is you actually want to look at the actual use case, which is readily available, which is the frustrating thing. It's not like these data, this particular data is hidden. So what's the singular use case of Tether? Well, the singular use case of Tether is to stay on centralized exchanges and move into a risk-off asset while you're moving out of BTC. And within that particular use case, the velocity, so the particular function is 90 times better than that of the US dollar in the fiat form, because it avoids the friction of going into actual fiat.
Yeah, but in here you get interest mingle in and stumble in the way. So there's not only the essence of efficiency and progressing processes and so on. There are so many power, words and interests that it's obvious that.
That's why someone said earlier, and that's the obvious logical conclusion. You're better off to tackle a space where there's no infrastructure. I just published an article on the intersection of poverty and blockchain-based solutions. So if you don't have a land registry to begin with, and/or it got destroyed, then yes, you should think of a blockchain-based solution. You probably have an easier time addressing that particular market. But if you have incumbents that make a living of maintaining these data silos, this is going to be an uphill battle, right?
Yeah.
But there's millions of opportunities right now for people that have an eye towards that. Just think about it much simpler than most people do. And don't get distracted by useless terms such as cryptocurrencies. The number of cryptocurrencies we need is somewhere between 0 and 1. It's just people not understanding, by and large, client-server architecture and/or how value transfer works today, right?
So there are so many issues to master, and for the beginners and the newcomers, I just want to say that we're at the beginning of the revolution. So it's so interesting and dynamic, and so it's a brand new world for me. So I'm sure that for people that just came to this industry, they have a lot to learn and a lot of excitement and a lot of opportunities that you said. And I would like, from my bottom of my heart, to thank you for your time and your wisdom and your willingness to share all this fantastic experience. And I'm very honorable to have you here today. And I'm sure people could use those insights that you shared with us in this webinar, and I really want to thank you. So I hope we'll see you in some other occasions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Millie.
Thank you, Millie.
Thank you, dear.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Kea.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Andy. Thank you, Christian.